Hello, welcome to today's newspaper review. We'll start with the Daily Sun newspaper. On the Daily Sun newspaper, boldly written, Abdul Salami Abubakar exclusive. He says nothing like Abacha loot. You get the full story on page 21 of that newspaper. Then at the top of the same newspaper, according to reports, bandits invade social media, turn influencers. You get this full story on page 4 and page 5 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper, tension in Osun over APC PDP council takeover. You continue reading on page 27 of the same newspaper. At the bottom of that newspaper, today happens to be Ekiti State governorship election, and it's stated there that judgment day for Onyebanji. You get the full story on page 29 of the newspaper. Then lastly, on this particular newspaper, Reverend Gbemi Olaleyi has stated why she dumped nursing in UK to become a pastor's wife in Nigeria. You continue reading on page 12 and page 13 of the newspaper. Away from that newspaper to the Matrix newspaper. On the Matrix newspaper, the lead page says Ekiti decides it's D-Day. At the top of that same newspaper, from the presidency's office, they've stated why Tinubu granted customs CG Adeniyi final 6 months tenure extension. You continue reading the newspaper on page 3 of that newspaper. Still in the same newspaper at the top, federal government malls allowing reporters join military missions on insecurity. At the bottom of that same newspaper, foreign reserves hit 17-year high as presidency mocks Peter Obi, Atiku Abubakar, and other critics. Still in the same newspaper, EFCC, DSS partner to sharpen surveillance skills against criminal activities in Lagos. Then on entertainment, Yul Edochie slams Judy Austin's ex-husband that he didn't stop him from seeing his children. Away from that newspaper to the Vanguard newspaper. On the Vanguard newspaper, gunshots as Abia youths show the way. Attack terrorists, rescue kidnap victims. You get the full story on page 12 of the newspaper. Then the follow-up stories. Kidnapped and widow stated that they beat her, threatened to kill her for speaking Igbo on phone. Then a tricycle operator also said that I fought back, determined not to die alone. At the top of that newspaper is still Ekiti Day. 10 parties go for Oyebanji's office. You get the full story on page 30 of the newspaper. Then this is a very sad story at the top of this newspaper on page 33, where a young man stated that I waited 27 years to revenge. That's Cross River mystery killers. He said he waited for 27 years before he revenged the death of his father. In the process, he had to behead 2 elders. Then on page 6 of that newspaper, coming from the former Minister of Petroleum, Dezani Alison Madueke says that UK ruined my reputation and integrity. Then Kwara ends era of missing files. Endless delays in land administration. You get the full story on page 4 of the newspaper. We'll move away from that newspaper to the Nigerian Tribune. On the Nigerian Tribune newspaper, still Ekiti Pool. I think this is the top stories trending today on the headlines. Amotekun, vigilante groups barred from election duty. You get the full story on page 2 of the newspaper. Then on page 13 of the newspaper, Cross River's alleged serial killer says, I was avenging the death of my parents and brother. You get the full story on page 13 of the newspaper. The young man said he was avenging the death of his parents and that of his brother. The guy that said he waited for 27 years before avenging the death of his family. Then on page 5 of the newspaper, drama as 2 lawyers appear for PDP in Wabara, orders suit against INEC. At the bottom of that newspaper on page 3, insecurity, impunity threatening fundamental rights in Nigeria. UN envoy says. We move away from that newspaper to the Guardian. On the Guardian newspaper, unbeatable as Ekiti, electorate dream smooth poll. You get the full story on page 8 of that newspaper. Still in the same newspaper, on xenophobia. South Africa's reputational erosion is not theoretical. You get the full story on page 30 of that newspaper. Then on page 2 of the newspaper by the right, Tinubu orders security reinforcement at NIPSS after deadly attack. Then on page 3 of that same newspaper, President Bola Ahmed Tinubu has hailed Wike, saying that you have not disappointed me. That's coming from the presidency. You continue reading on page 3 of that same newspaper. Then on page 35 of the newspaper, police arrest suspected bandits logistics supplier in Kwara State. The police has succeeded in arresting suspected bandit logistics supplier in Kwara State. Then on page 35 of the newspaper as well, AIG scores Governor Mba high on investment in modern security infrastructure. Away from that newspaper to the Punch newspaper. On the Punch newspaper, the lead page says, Oyo abduction, inside terrorists plot to stall rescue. You get the full story on page 4 of the newspaper. APC, PDP, ADC battle for votes in 16 local government areas in Ekiti State urban serial election. You continue reading on page 8 of the newspaper. At the top of that newspaper, coming from Nollywood actress Linda Osifu, she has stated that being talented alone is not enough to make it in Nollywood. So if you're talented, if you feel that your talent is going to make you make it big in Nollywood industry, this is coming from an insider that you being talented alone is not enough to make it in the industry. Then on page 5 of the newspaper, Cross River farmer, I beheaded 2 elders to avenge my parents' death. According to the report, the guy said he beheaded 2 elders to revenge his parents' death. Then on xenophobia, flight delays leave stranded Nigerians hungry and homeless in South Africa. Then on page 5 of that newspaper, bandit's mother sits at jail for 40 years for aiding terrorism. Bandit's mother and sister have been jailed for 40 years for aiding terrorism. Away from that newspaper to the Daily Trust newspaper. On the Daily Trust newspaper, the hidden untold story about the death of General Rep. You get the full story on page 4 of the newspaper. Then on page 14 of that newspaper, over 1 million voters to decide next Ekiti governor today. So over 1 million voters are set to decide the fate of Ekiti State election today. Why PDP crisis has defied court judgment. You get the full story on page 23 of that newspaper. Then at the bottom of the newspaper on page 9, why we ride a top trailers from Port Harcourt to Sokoto State. Away from that newspaper to the New Telegraph. On the New Telegraph newspaper, lawyers weigh in on judgment ordering deregistration of parties. You continue reading on page 2 of that newspaper. At the top of the newspaper on page 13, how my dad endured being in same class with my brother to further career in theater. That's coming from Kola Oyewo's son. Still in the same newspaper, CBN forex reserves hit $51.4 billion. You get the full story on page 4 of that newspaper. Tinubu orders security reinforcement at NIPSS. You continue reading on page 7 of the same newspaper. Then this is coming from Senator Abba Muru. Interview. On an interview, he says that Nigeria's democracy not on the right track. That Nigerian democracy is not on the right track. You get the full story on page 20 of the newspaper. Police warn against unauthorized election results as over 1 million voters elect new governor today in Ekiti State. You continue reading on page 3 of that newspaper. We've come to the end of the newspaper review. Many thanks for watching and do have a beautiful day. I remain Kasituni.